Welcome, everyone. I'm here to record another fireside chat, and not just another fireside chat, but another fireside chat with Tobie Langel, who's working with the Open Source Security Foundation. And we're here to talk about uh, jQuery, of all things. And I'm really curious about, the impact this library has had on, the internet development ecosystem, maybe some of the security concerns around this library, and just some thoughts on thinking about security when we're developing web apps. So be sure to stick around to the end of the video to get all the great details. Thanks for watching, and let's get started. Welcome back, everyone. We're here to do another fireside chat. This time I'm joined again by Tobie Langel from the Open Source Security Foundation, and we're here to talk about a library that you love it, hate it. I know you know it. It's called jQuery, and its impact on the internet and some of the security implications around a project like jQuery. I find this topic really interesting. So let's start with some introductions. I'll start with myself. I'm Cody Zuschlag. I'm a developer relations engineer at Nearform, and I'm based in France. So something interesting about me, like I like to do that in introductions, is I love mountain biking, and I mountain bike in the summertime mostly when there's a lot of snow where I live. It's kind of hard to get out, and I have electric mountain bikes, so you can either say I'm lazy or that I like to go for longer rides. It's probably somewhere in between or a little bit of both. And I've broken two bones mountain biking, a collarbone and a rib. So it wasn't like I was doing anything fancy. It just like fell over and fell over wrong and you end up with some broken bones. But I'm pretty lucky because those aren't serious injuries. There's nothing to do. So hopefully that's interesting. You know a little bit more about me. Tobie, I want to know more about you. So what is your day job? What do you do with the Open Source Security Foundation? And tell us something interesting about you.
Sure thing. So, hi again. My name is Tobie Langel. I'm based in Geneva, Switzerland. I run a small consulting firm called Unlock Open, where I essentially focus on open source and open standard strategy. But although I do sort of more sort of strategic consulting, I actually started off as a developer, a front end developer. Was one, and this is sort of like how I ended up in open source. I got involved with the prototype JavaScript library in the effect library that went with it called Scriptaculous, which were sort of like the hotness and like a number of years ago at this point, which got sort of like their lunch eaten by jQuery. So it's kind of there's like a some form of like closing loop and irony around being involved again with jQuery, like so long after this project and so long after all this stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, my consulting firm like works with a number of clients in different organizations, and the OpenSSF and the OpenJSF are just like two of the organizations that I'm currently working with. Well, I mean, starting to work with on the jQuery project, and it's a really interesting project because we've talked about security and open source quite a bit over the last like few years, and we have a really good understanding of what open source security means for most software, because it's essentially a software that you pull in from the internet onto your servers and then you run, right? And so what you really want to make sure when you talk about that security, what you want to make sure is that the security of the code itself, right? You're not really thinking about like anything beyond that. Whereas when you think about jQuery, it's not something that you're running on your servers at all, right? It's something that sits on uh, that ends up being run by the devices of your end users.
Right. In the browser at the end of the day, but
Exactly, right? And so there's the security picture around this is a lot more complex and large, and touches into a lot more of the runtime security aspects, like the kind of security that like systems administrators are used to handling, right? Like making sure that like the so you know the the stack that you're running that software on is secure, not just the software itself. And so that's a lot of the thinking that is going into thinking about the security of jQuery. I mean, one of the biggest reasons being that jQuery is actually available from a CDN that is hosted by the OpenJS Foundation, right, and run by Cloudflare. And so, like when you're talking about the security of jQuery, you're also talking about the security of that infrastructure and of pushing the bytes of like a new version of jQuery into that infrastructure. So it's like it's a different picture. And then there's also the other aspect, which is um, the security of the software is organized by the runtime, right? I mean, the browser's runtime, right? The browser sandbox makes sure that like the jQuery code won't do anything bad, but there's plenty of ways that developers who are relying on jQuery or other JavaScript frameworks can sort of shoot themselves in the foot. For example, by running code from their users, or by not like sanitizing user input, right? There's a whole bunch of things that of in that realm, and so that's not directly part of the question of the security of the JavaScript jQuery library itself, but it is a security concern nonetheless, right? And so there's also all of that part of the education around this, and what can you do about this, and should you do about this?
I love the way that you break that into different parts, right? There's the running jQuery and like the secure how secure is the code that runs, but it's actually running in a browser, which is like its own secure or not secure place. And then there's the infrastructure where jQuery is packaged and built and deployed. So it's such a great example of all the different security aspects that go into a project like jQuery. Yeah, I think that's such an important point. And as I've heard some of the talk at the OpenJS Foundation, some of these statistics, and I realize these come from Wikipedia, so everything's true on Wikipedia, right? No, these are actually these stats actually have.
A lot of things are actually true. There's some research that showed that the amount of mistakes on Wikipedia were not bigger than in sort of like the famous encyclopedias that that you would get like in the physical form.
I love that. I love that.
But they did get fixed faster.
And they get fixed faster. Is the thing. Well, if anyone wants to read these on jQuery on Wikipedia, they can because they do have references. But it says as of August 2022, jQuery is used by 77% of the 10 million most popular websites. So I'm reading that right off of Wikipedia, which is just this insane thing because I do a lot of web development now, and in my consulting work, I'm using a lot of React because that's just like the most popular JavaScript framework for front end development right now. I'm not gonna say it's the best, but it's like the standard. And like jQuery, like I wouldn't touch jQuery, and I just wouldn't think about it running on 77% of the 10 million most popular websites. It's insane. And the second thing they say, web analysis indicates that it is the most widely deployed JavaScript library by a large margin, having at least 3 to 4 times more usage than any other JavaScript library. And I just find those two statistics mind blowing. That that's such a foundation of the internet, and something that we kind of take for granted as developers. I don't know. Do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, internet scale, like we don't understand what it means. No, seriously, it's just like you move from talking about you know, a few million developers, right, to billions of people. And like the long tail is, nuts. Like the amount of legacy stuff is nuts. And also, like just look at things like WordPress, etc. Like a lot of it's still, a lot of like the WordPress plugins rely on a jQuery version being around, right? So there's lots of stuff like that that's just like happening, and it was fairly common. I don't know now, but it was fairly common for multiple different versions of jQuery to be loaded in the same page, right? Because different teams relied on like different versions, right? And so there's even a system baked into jQuery that it actually like sort of generates. a unique identifier for itself in the page, so that if there are two versions running, well, it knows which one is which and doesn't start like mix matching the APIs.
Yeah. Yeah, the internet scale, like you said, and that is, yeah, especially using WordPress. I think that's interesting because you're so abstracted. A website administrator who's making a website with WordPress, they're so abstracted away from the fact that it's running jQuery under the hood, right? It's
No, absolutely. But I mean, it's to the point that it's still a running joke. Like, how do you add like numbers using jQuery, right?
I don't know. I don't know this joke.
No, I mean, at some point, it was just like so pervasive. Right? Everyone relied on it all over the place. It meant JavaScript, right? And so, like, Stack Overflow was full of people asking, well, I can't find a plugin to do like, this really basic stuff that you would do just with the language, or, just with the DOM, right? Yeah. And so that's also part of like I'm assuming where it stays. There's so much information. And frankly, I mean, credits to John Razek and the whole team behind it, right? Like, it really, jQuery, it was kind of magic when it showed up, right? It literally turned anyone that was building a website into a magician making things move on the screen. Like, you could fade stuff in and out, just like by typing like the CSS selector and like dot hide, dot disappear, whatever it was, right? And that was magic back then. And the sort of like interesting story for me that was working on Prototype, right? Prototype was sort of like the library that was right before, and it had sort of like a lot of the same pieces, but it was really designed to build sort of like Web 2.0 apps. And jQuery sort of like bridged the gap between CSS and writing code.
Right. With the swizzle selectors and yeah.
And yeah, that was magic. People could just like, they had a blog and they just could like, put those little touches of JavaScript here and there. And we were kind of like, we're the engineers, like we're doing the thing to build applications, so we're all proud of ourselves. And we're like, yeah, they're just script kiddies, like it's like, you know, and obviously what happened, which I think is a lesson, like, for like any kind of like development and like software stuff at that kind of scale, is like turned out that jQuery was good enough to do 80% of what, Prototype could let you do, right? And like so many people had just had their hands into it already, they just carried it over, right? And then the 20% that were left, like that got caught up in like no time. And like in like a year, like it was gone, like the essentially the market went from like this tiny bit to like this huge market, and Prototype did not grow. Right? And the rest of the market was just jQuery. And so, yeah, that was fascinating to me. It's just like it, and the fact that it's still around comes from there. Like, it was just really smart, right at the right place, and also like a huge focus on developer advocacy and like holding people's hand and showing them how the thing was working, and empowering people to do really cool stuff, right? And those are very effective.
I think you touched on a lot of really important points. And I said before, like I wouldn't touch jQuery now, and I want to say that like jQuery, like I think jQuery like is one of the reasons why JavaScript is a successful programming language now, right? Because without jQuery, I still think JavaScript kind of be kind of niche, right? Like maybe you're doing some scripts, some animations on your web page, but that's my personal feelings. I did some jQuery development.
That's questionable, but it's like
There's probably a lot of things that went into making that the case, and I think it was really a revolutionary library. But I guess your point is like it basically did what prototypes did, and then added some of its own magic, right? So
everything is always like a tiny incremental step on top of what's there before. But like there are incremental steps where like things completely change, right? I mean, the example that's used for that, which I just saw in like James Clear book called Atomic Habits, is he talks about when you move the temperature, you have an ice cube, and it's like minus 20 degrees Celsius, right? And you just move the temperature up half a degree by half a degree, right? And like literally nothing happens for a very long time. And suddenly you hit 0 degree and your ice cube melts, right? Right, and like, but it's and there's no difference in the step between like -1 degree and 0 degree and -20 degree and -19, right? But, like, the outcome are completely different, and I think jQuery is really one of those, right? It's just like it was this tiny thing on top, but it was the right thing at the right time, it was the right packaging, and just that opened up, like, the floodgates, right? And suddenly, sort of like, everyone that had been dabbling was, like, client-side stuff, like CSS and HTML, was just like, "And now I can make magic," right?
That's such a good point, and because it was so easy to use, the way that they package it the right time and the right way. I think that's really important. I think it's also really important to think that jQuery, we say jQuery like it's just one library, but it's like multiple libraries, right? Like you have the templating system, you have the swizzle selectors, the CSS selectors, the hooks to run code when after the page loads, or the DOM is loaded. There's so many different parts to jQuery, so I also find the conversation difficult because it's we talk about like it's one thing, but it's like a lot of things.
Well, sure, but I mean, if you compare that to like more modern sort of like libraries and frameworks, I mean, it's still like it's one document. It's one page, one file, right? Was like sure there are like four or five different parts to it, but they're sort of like all combined with a build thing in the releases. So it's yeah, I find that, I mean, compared to like, other libraries like that exist today, I find that I find that less difficult to sort of apprehend as one thing as a whole.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess I was thinking along the lines of if we were going to try to, I'm looking for the right word, modernize a website or a web application. So, okay, I want to, remove a jQuery. I'm going to try to use some more modern standardized web APIs or replace, some things with something else. There's like a lot of different parts to jQuery that, I don't know. I guess there's two different camps, right? There's the camp we should have one framework that does one thing really well, and there's the camp we should have, frameworks that do a whole bunch of things that work well together. And that's the challenge I see with jQuery now.
So one of the things that like people that develop for the web today don't well haven't experienced is the fact that when these libraries existed originally to fix the fact that none of the browsers had the same APIs, right? Just like doing an AJAX request, you literally had to run through different objects, see if they were there and if they were behaving properly, and use one of them, right? And right, and that was true for for a lot of things, right? And there were like different bugs in different browsers you couldn't use. I mean, like inner HTML you couldn't use was like tables that that didn't work. So you had to sort of, if you were like injecting document elements, you had to like check what kind of elements are you injecting and into what, and then you would have different code paths for these. So a lot of like those libraries back then were just like you know random stuff to deal with like the absurd landscape that the different browsers were, right? And on top,
They're providing a
well, yeah, there was like a layer essentially of like, uh, yeah, sort of. I don't know. I can't find my words right now, but sort of like leveling the different like discrepancies, and then on top of it, there was a layer that was making it more like just nicer to use.
right. Well, that syntax was cool, the dollar sign syntax back in the day, but yeah, it's like this abstraction, creating like a more general API on top of some of those weird inconsistencies that existed. And I think that's an important point now. Like some of the things that jQuery did really good, there are, standardized web APIs to do them now. The CSS selectors, they came from jQuery, right? But they're now standardized in, the most used browsers now. Today. So the CSS selectors, like we have that, and I'm thinking about the on DOM loaded events, like those have been standardized too in the browsers.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a bunch of things that now exist in the browsers. Um, and so, the story is completely different. Like, should you start a new website and use jQuery today? Probably not, right? Because like all of that stuff is in the browsers anyway, right? But like, the problem that you're facing if you're trying to modernize like an old code base, it's like, well, you have all of these plugins that are relying on jQuery being there, right? So, it's like, what do you do? Do you change everything? Do you like have an API that's like talking directly to more modern APIs? Like, there are all of these questions, right? And those are interesting questions to ponder and to answer. But then there's also the question of like, is this where you want to put resources, right? Does it make sense to invest in, having like um, having a jQuery library that would be sort of like just the nice API layer on top of like the DOM stuff today, would that be useful? It's a good question. Would it? Like, are we losing anything? Like, is the performance hit that we're taking was all of the lower level stuff worth addressing? Does it create like issues that like we could avoid? Like, we don't really have good answers to this, and I think part of like the work that we need to do in that space is like get a better sense of, okay, what exactly are the problems, right? Are there like real threats? What are those threats? How can we address those threats, right? It's like we don't it's not super clear.
Yeah, I love that point. So let's, yeah, to kind of close this point off, like let's bring it back to that security question. So what are the security challenges that you see around jQuery? And I know we kind of define them as we have the infrastructure, we have uh, the actual software itself, what's running, then how it interacts with the browser. So what should developers be thinking about now in terms of security if they're thinking about jQuery?
So if developers like web developers are thinking about security, I think that frankly one of the key things that they should be thinking about is um, to be careful with user input, because that remains like a classic way of poking holes in a website. Is if you just take user content and display it somewhere, there are plenty of really dangerous things that you can do. You can get access to other people's data. You can potentially get their passwords. Like, there are plenty of things that you can do, right? And so, uh, you know, a lot of the security, I mean, the security of like the code that you're running is handled by the browser and its sandbox, right? Um, but like, once you're inside of a browser, if you're doing silly things with the code of other users and logged in sessions for like another user, then you're really creating risk, right? And so that's really, I think, what developers must be really careful about. And that's like, there's a lot of work happening in the standard space around this question, right? Can you have like around sanitized user content, for example, right? Because it's nice to be able to allow users to write structured text, right? Add links and all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when it comes to what web developers can do, always for me, like, well, the browser sandbox takes care of a lot of the security issues, right? But the biggest hurdle for developers is really sort of like all of those cross-site scripting and issues that sort of like are related to essentially end user input, unsanitized end user input ending up in the wrong places at the wrong time. And as much as that's dangerous when you actually like uh, uh, saving content in databases, right? It is just as dangerous or similarly dangerous when you're actually displaying that content, especially for logged in users, right? I mean, the classic scenario is there's malicious code in a piece of content. that gets displayed to you when that has been written by another user that you're editing, and that gets displayed to you while you're logged in with your admin, root level access to the app, and suddenly. Your billing information is leaked. So, like, weird stuff like this happens, right? And so, to me, that's like the usual sort of like things that web developers should pay more attention to. And what's interesting is, we talked earlier about how a lot of the stuff that was in jQuery is kind of like no longer relevant, or has been sort of moved to the lower layer of the web, right? Of the standards, right? And it's now there, and the CSS selectors is a good example. And so there's a significant amount of work that's sort of like going down the same path around sanitized user content, right? So you can lots of different bits and pieces, but the idea is making it easy for users to be able to use markup in their content, and for developers to be able to display that safely without having to sanitize it themselves, because that is actually very difficult to do properly.
Right. Some regular expressions and do. Yeah, Markdown is such a great example, right? Because we can, depending on what flavor Markdown we're using, we can, put HTML in Markdown, and some of it works and some of it doesn't. But that means it's getting parsed at some point.
Right. And even if there is sort of like now the HTML parser has been like extremely precisely defined in HTML5, you can find bugs in the parser, right? And suddenly, like, you know, something that doesn't look like a script tag ends up looking like a script tag, and then you start putting in stuff, right? And like, running Bitcoin mining on people's websites. Right?
That's the classic example. I was thinking jQuery is a good example of just being aware of supply chain security, because there's a lot of legacy websites that might be pulling down like an old version of jQuery. And are there any known security issues in that old version? Who's maintaining that? Who's going to update that? And if you deploy a website with jQuery, who's going to update the versions of jQuery if there's any known security vulnerabilities in the version that you're using? And I think that's a lot of the work that's happening right at the OpenJS Foundation. Is they're helping create infrastructure like we talked about in the beginning, that's going to be secure and going to ensure the future of that project, and make sure that the supply chain is secure as much as we can. So I find that kind of an interesting subject with jQuery too, because it's this classic example of devs just use it and forget about it, right? Or they don't even know they're using it. Sometimes is the other strange part.
Yeah, the other thing that I find really interesting about jQuery is, and that's true of like all code, right? Is like there's a life cycle, right? Like there's a moment where that code is like the new hotness. It's brand new. It's like really serving a purpose that you couldn't do with anything else really that easily. And then, like, as time goes by, like it starts being part of those lower layers, and sort of being replaced and sort of like being pulled into um, the browser engine, or like Node Core, or like whatnot, right? Like a whole bunch of things that we're doing today, for example, around AI, will end up like being APIs and like GPUs in like 5 years, right? And we will no, and we'll have those sort of like legacy libraries that will be just like wrappers around like new stuff, right? And so, like that's a thing that we don't think about enough, collectively in our industry, is like maintenance and life cycle of things, right? What does it mean? A project, like everything has, a life cycle, and how do we think about this? How do we handle this stuff? And how can we be a little more maybe proactive about this, and sort of like less lugging around all of this old stuff, and more about making sure that we know when it is time to turn to different pages. Right?
Ooh, Tobie, Langel, that's I love that, like ending on a question, right? Something for folks to think about who are watching this video. Thank you so much for your time. I think we're going to be talking about this topic more. I look forward to talking about this more with you. And yeah, I feel like we're just scraping the surface, right? So
We are.
let's look forward to the next time.
Well, it's a good start.
It's a great start. Thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. That was a pleasure.
Cut.